To come and talk to you this morning. I love to have a time where people who are united around a community come together, and food is always a treat on top of that. So thank you for being here and spending a little bit of time. Pastor Abby heard me talk a few months ago and thought that perhaps some of the information that I might have to share could be interesting to you. And I think that churches especially have such an important role to play in our community. You are united around a common cause, around community, and that's where some of the most powerful work gets done. So I would really encourage you to think about the information I present today as where do you fit in? Personally, where do you fit in as a community and as a church? And I hope that I could give you some good ideas for that. So my name is Lori Seibel. I'm the president of an organization called the Community Health Endowment. And I bet some of you will and some of you won't, but who remembers Lincoln General Hospital? Yeah, you notice the young people say, nope, don't remember that anymore. Lincoln General Hospital, of course, was what was sold by the city in 1997. The city owned that hospital. They sold it to Bryan to create Bryan East and West. And the proceeds from that sale were about $38 million. The decision was then to put those funds into an endowment, to grow them at the rate of inflation, so that it's worth to these folks today what it was worth to us back then, and then to return money back to the community to make a healthier city. So that's what we've been trying to do. The fund has grown to about $65 million. We've given about $35 million away. So that sale of the hospital so far has had about $100 million impact on the community. And we really are grateful for the opportunity to do that. But sometimes people say to me, that must be the best job, like in the whole world. You just sit around and write checks and give money away, make people happy. And as you might expect, you say no more than you say yes. And it's often a very difficult job because people have passions. People feel very strongly about things. And so over the course of this time, it's really been important to me that I think about how we can make the best decisions possible. So my training is as an epidemiologist, a person who looks at data and basically tries to figure out what stories that information is telling us. And so there was a story that was relayed to me when I was in graduate school that I want to share with you because I think it kind of helps set the stage. The story happens back in London, England, and it was back in the mid-1800s. So London was a really dirty city. And, so imagine there was only coal smoke, there was no sewage system, there was incredibly crowded, 2.4 million people in London in a size that Lincoln is today. There were animals inside and outside of homes. So if you were to go into London, England, and looked at that, you would say, especially based on what we know in more recent times, that was a disaster waiting to happen. And so there was a lot of disease, and chief among those diseases was cholera. Now, cholera was a terrible disease. It caused a terrible death. I won't even go into that. But people had a strong held belief that it was caused by this air they were breathing. And that would make sense because the air smelled, it was polluted. So they simply believed it was something they had to accept, that it was a product of living in a dirty city. So there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Snow, and he was an anesthesiologist. And he didn't believe that cholera was caused by the air. He had a different idea. And so he decided that he was going to reach out and try to discover the cause of cholera. Now I want you to keep a couple things in mind because the characteristics that he brings into the story are characteristics that I think the church has to have today. First of all, he was a very curious person. And I think sometimes curiosity is lost today. We have to be curious about not only where we live, but the people who live here, and if we really are going to make change. And so he went into this area. It was called Soho. It was a slum. And that's another thing that I want you to keep in mind. So he went into a part of the city where he didn't live. He didn't live there. He didn't know people there. Sometimes we have to go into parts of our community where we don't live, where perhaps make us uncomfortable. Perhaps places where we have to really work a little harder. And also, he didn't go in with the idea he was going to solve cholera everywhere. Sometimes we get stuck in the idea that if we work on an issue, we have to fix it 100%. We have to make sure that we reach far and wide. But what I've discovered over time is sometimes if you start in a place, the place you know or the place that you're willing to go, and you work hard there, you could have great impact, far greater than you imagine. And that could have a ripple effect far and wide, and that's what happened to Dr. Snow. So he went into this area. It was called Soho. This was his actual map from his archives that are now in London. And he walked up and down the streets of Soho, and he knocked on doors, and he asked people about their experiences with cholera. And every time that he discovered someone who he knew had died from cholera, he marked them with this little rectangle. So you can see this was his map, a very simple map. So what did he do? He did what good epidemiologists do, is he stood back and he looked at it. And he said, what story is this information telling me? And we see right in the center, there's a water pump. And he said, it's not the air, it's the water. So everybody rallied around him and said, hurrah, right? No. People said, it's the air. We know it's the air. People can get pretty set in their ways and are not easy to change. Another skill we can learn from Dr. Snow in all of this is that you have to be pretty tenacious sometimes. You have to really stick to an issue. And you also have to learn that the idea that he walked into a city filled with disease, a neighborhood filled with disease with no known origin and no known cure, it's a pretty brave thing to do. You gotta have bravery too. You gotta be courageous to do some of this work. So he went to the city council or whoever it was, and he said, it's not the air, it's the water. And they said, we don't believe you, we know what it is, and they rebuffed him. He did that repeatedly. Sometimes that happens too. But along the way, he gained some traction, and what happened has a couple of different endings. Maybe the city council changed it and took out the water pump. Perhaps he, as some people say, took a bucket of lye and poured it down the well so that nobody could drink the water. But this is the picture I like the best. He walked down to the corner and he broke off the pump handle. So what I want you to think about as we go through some of these maps is if a simple map from 1854 could tell us a story, if it could have a ripple effect in one neighborhood that changed that city, that country, the world, it changed infectious disease forever. It saved tens of thousands of lives. How could a simple map from today help inform you? How could it help change you? How could it help change this church when you bring alongside some of those characteristics that Dr. Snow brought with him? So I want to start with a project, telling you about a project we call Place Matters. Our question was, does it matter, just like in London, does it matter where you live in Lincoln? Does it matter? Are you... It's sliding. Where is it? There it is. I'll bring it back up here. Okay. Place Matters. So we have done this 4 times now, so this is 4.0. We do it every 2 years. We're in the middle of doing 5.0 right now, and so I don't have that information, but I will share with you the information that we have published to date. And I'm going to start with poverty. Now, I know you can't see this very well, but I want to give you a little bit of an orientation. So this is Lincoln, outlined by this blue line. Right here is 27th and O. And so right here in this red area, this gray area, is the university. We've taken their data out of this. So they're not included, our university population. Here is also the airport. That's not included in our data. There's a few homes in this area, but we're not including those. And then we also have the regional center, which houses our folks with severe and persistent mental illness, and then here's the prison. Now, the rest of the community is divided into census tracts, and each one of those census tracts has approximately the same number of people. So we can compare those census tracts to each other. If we use zip codes, for example, they cover a really wide area. So we can cut those into smaller neighborhoods, even sub-neighborhoods, and begin to look at how our community is the same or different. So we began looking at poverty. This is from 1980. And so anytime you see anything that is red or orange, perhaps yellow, you know things are worse there than they are in the rest of the community. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to morph this, and hopefully you can begin to see how poverty has impacted our community over time. You'll see that poverty stretch out, you'll see it move in different directions, and you'll see poverty affecting more than 50% of people in those darkest red areas. So over half the people who live there live in poverty. So what is poverty? It's about $25,000 for a family of 4. So why is poverty important? I'm a health foundation, so why should I care about poverty? Well, I liken it back to that water. That water, it's kind of like poisoned water. It's the water that's underneath the surface. You can't always see it. Sometimes you can, but a lot of times you can't. It's shifting and it's changing and it's moving and it's kind of just eroding the fabric of a neighborhood slowly. And we also know that people who are poor are more likely to get sick, and they're more likely to get sick more seriously because a lot of times they don't get their checkups as often, or perhaps they don't get the medication they need on a regular basis. We also know they're less likely to eat healthy. They perhaps have there's more obesity or diabetes in those populations. So poverty matters. Poverty is the cause of causes. And if you're going to think of it any other way, I would think of it as that. It is this baseline factor we have to consider if we're going to talk about any community. And these maps also serve as incredibly helpful planning documents. So if you're going to think about where do I go in our community to help people that are poor, where should I put my nonprofit? Where should I put bus routes? Where should I do food distribution? It's not as if we don't know. We know. It's just important that we use information in a way that helps us make the best decisions. I'm going to give you another example. I'm going to give you, I'm going to stick on poverty for just a second. People say, well, you know, poverty is you just can't, it's a product of people's own decisions, right? They got themselves there. They have to get themselves out. But if we look at this map over here, this is a map from 1933, and it's of Lincoln. And back in the 30s, the government actually sent out maps to cities and said, we're going to tell you where you can loan people money for homes. Banks, you cannot loan people money if they live in these areas that are red. And I would really caution you not to loan people money if they live in those yellow areas as well. In fact, the government, you can't see it, but down here, the little index tells us that they called the red areas hazardous to banks. So while yes, there's always personal decisions involved in things, but you also have to understand some of this is a product of our history. It's a product of how we got to this point. And sometimes if you haven't had the chance to buy a home several generations ago, that generational wealth has never been passed on in families. That is a huge, huge factor in poverty. So keep in mind that it's not always about the decisions you made. It's about the community and the decisions that were made. So if I look at where poverty is 30 to 60%, which is right here around the core of our community. And then I compare it to where poverty is 0 to 5%. And just for a point of reference, we're about right here. What about a difference in life expectancy? Is it really affect us that much? How long can we expect to live if we live in these different areas of our town? Does place matter? Well, we know that if you live in the core of the city, your life expectancy is 72.3 years. But we also know if you live in these areas, it's 81.8 years. So there's a 10-year difference in life expectancy. For those of us who are getting older, 10 years it's a pretty big deal, right? We'd like to stick around for a while. So place does matter. And I want to give you some more examples of that. Oh, I added some more slides in here the other day, and I keep forgetting I added them. So what do we do about that? We looked at these maps and we said, how can we make an impact in the core of the community on health? Maybe some of you have seen this. It's the Health 360 Integrated Clinic right at 23rd and O. We said instead of finding a building somewhere that is outside of where we need it to be, we're going to go right into 23rd and O, and we're going to build a clinic. And it's not only a physical clinic, but it's a mental health clinic. So those things are integrated. One thing we do not do well in this country is integrate mental health and physical health. It's seen as two entirely different systems. And we're trying to pull that together so that there is one waiting room here. When people go in, they may be going to see a psychiatrist, they may be going to get their blood pressure checked, nobody knows. It reduces the stigma and it integrates that care. So these are the kinds of things that we can do using these maps. So I want to take and look at where poverty is above average. So this is where poverty is among our community's average. Now I want to lay it over with people of color, our minority population. So what did you see? Kind of the same, right? If we lay them over and look at these purple areas, we know that if you take all of the areas of where minority population is above average, 83% of those areas also have above average poverty. So here's the facts. If you are a person of color in our community, you are linked to living in poverty. It's just the way it is. I wish I could tell you that it's not, but it is. Being a person of color in Lincoln means you are vastly more likely to live in poverty. Some people ask me about this spot right down here. This is right where we are. How can you have an above average minority population there? Anyone know? I'm sorry? You have a subsidized housing right here. So you can there's more people of color who are living in that area. This is the area right around Union College. A lot of people talk about that. And that's a great thing. When you see these spots, this is a very large apartment complex that's right across between 27th and 56th on Highway 2 to the south. A lot of apartments in there. Union College, a lot of people say, what's happening there? It's a changing neighborhood. You talk to a lot of folks there and they say this neighborhood is very different than what it used to be. A lot of folks who were living downtown are finding new places to live. But imagine, and we've been in conversations between the church there, between the college there, how they can make a difference. And they're saying, we are responsible for this neighborhood and we have to do some things to change it. So these are the kind of maps that have spurred folks into action. So, okay, we have this problem. This poverty is linked to people who are living in color, or people of color. So let's take a look at this. Let's look at the population by race in Lancaster County. Back in 1990, the orange represents people, the non-Hispanic white population, the blue is people of color. So let's go till today. It's about 80% and 20%. Let's go out another 30 years, and it's about 63% and 34%. So if we don't disconnect living in poverty from being a person of color, what's going to happen? We're just going to have more poverty. So we have to be willing to figure out how to change some of these things. And that matters to all of us. That matters to young people. That matters to all of us. Do we want more poverty, or are we willing to kind of figure out how to make big change? Let me talk about some specific issues and why these maps really become relevant. So this is first trimester care. Getting care in the first trimester of your pregnancy, the first 3 months. Seems like a pretty basic concept. You want to make sure the mom's not smoking, not drinking, she gets on prenatal vitamins. all the things, builds your support system, all the things that are important to a healthy pregnancy. Because if you don't have a healthy pregnancy and you don't have a healthy baby, that is potentially a 75 to 80-year problem down the road. So our goal is that 80% of women would have first trimester care in our community. It seems like kind of a first world problem, first trimester care, right? But none of our census tracts meet that goal. We get close in all those green areas. But we also have areas there in orange and red where anywhere between 40 to 50% of women are not getting free first trimester care. You look at this area right here, this red area, that's our area. 40 to 50% of women are not getting first trimester care. That affects all of us. That changes our community when we don't have healthy babies. And we should all be committed to that. That should just be a no-brainer for our community. And so a map like this, what can it do? It says instead of putting these programs citywide and trying to find these women, we know exactly, it's not like we don't know where they are and where we need to go deeper and we need to work harder. In fact, I can go a little deeper. I can look at this by race and ethnicity. See, white women, 94% get first trimester care. And then it's downhill from that. Asian, Hispanic, Black, and American women. About 30, a little more than 30% of Native American women do not get first trimester care. So that's how these maps become useful. If I really only have a limited amount of money to spend, what am I going to do? I'm going to go there, and I'm going to reach out to these women. Now, that's not going to solve the whole problem, but boy, it will help us move the ball, the marker a little bit forward in terms of getting better outcomes. I want to look at how, I know your church is very, very engaged in food, right? And so I want to talk about healthy food. I'm a big believer that we have to work really hard to make sure people who need food have healthy food. It's not enough, in my mind, to fill stomachs. It's to fill stomachs with healthy food, because that's how we're going to get healthier kids. That's how we're going to get a healthier population. So we work with the university, and the university goes to every place that sells food in our community. Grocery stores, ethnic markets, convenience stores, gas stations, and they look for 5 things. They look, are you selling a fruit without any sugar on it? Are you selling a vegetable without any sauce on it? Are you selling a whole grain item, a low-fat protein, or a lean protein and a low-fat dairy? And if you sell them all, you get a score of 5. If you sell 3 of them, you get a score of 3. If you sell none of them, you get a score of 0. So these areas tell us in red where folks cannot get food in their neighborhood, healthy food in their neighborhood, where it's limited. Now, can people drive out of their neighborhood? You bet they can. But it's also a messaging thing. When you're driving through the neighborhood and you don't see messages that are encouraging healthy eating, or even if you don't have the option to get out of you're not able, you don't have transportation, perhaps you have to take a bus to get out of your neighborhood, having healthy food available in a community is really important. So how do you do something like this? I can't build grocery stores. I can't go in and tell people what to sell, right? So how do you change that? Here's something that we've done that I think is really exciting. We were able to purchase a truck. It's called Lincoln Fresh. It goes out into those areas that have been identified in red, and it gives away fresh produce. That's it. And to date, it's been 261 tons of food in a couple years. It's been, I think, 3 years, and that includes during COVID. It goes out and it says, here's the produce. Not only does it make it available to folks, but it allows kids to perhaps try foods that they've never been accustomed to before, get used to eating them, change their palate a little bit. And this is place-based work. This is saying we looked at the map, we saw where the problem was, and we addressed it. We also were able to build a kitchen out at Community Action. And the purpose of that kitchen is to do nothing more than to make meals for Head Start kids. You know, Head Start is our low-income childcare. And they eat there. They eat 2 meals and 2 snacks, 4 meals. If we have a chance to feed a poor kid, shouldn't we make sure it's healthy? And so that kitchen does nothing more than make healthy meals to take to Head Starts. And to date, it's been 2.1, almost 2.2 million meals have come out of that kitchen. in the last several years. So this, and at the end of the day, these projects are not that expensive. Yes, we bought a truck. It's basically a box truck. We work with the food bank in order to buy very reduced food. I think we spend maybe $20,000 a year on food. That's it. And it's changing people, it's changing neighborhoods. Now, I will tell you, I met with them the other day, they need a bigger truck. Because the real need is overwhelming. And so even as a church, if you're looking for something to support, I'm sure that they would welcome your help in helping them buy a bigger truck. I want to talk about fitness, kids' fitness. This map is probably the one map that tells me that perhaps today's young people are going to live shorter lives than we live. And that makes me sad. Did any of you have kids, or do any of you remember doing the PACER test? PACER test in LPS, did you do it? Yeah? You run back and forth for as long as you can, as fast as you can. And at the end of the day, that helps us understand your aerobic fitness. We're not looking at body mass index, which we think is kind of sketchy. Some kids are just built different. We're looking at, can you do that fitness test? We want 80% of our kids to be able to pass that PACER test. Now, keep in mind, this was before COVID, and I've seen the data. It's much worse now. But these areas that are in red, only 50 to 60% of kids are passing the PACER test. In yellow, 60 to 70%. That is something that we have to accept responsibility for. We have to get kids out and active. We have to understand that their health today represents what their health is in the future. And, we know, and this is key, this top bullet point, PACER results influence reading, writing, mathematics, and science grades. So if you're fit, you're a better student too. Why wouldn't we want that as well? So we have tried to fund some things down at the Malone Community Center. I would encourage any of you who have any interest in youth sports to check this out. We now have teams where these kids are going out, they're playing basketball, they're playing football. They won the regional championship, and they brought me one of those big honkin' Super Bowl rings the other day with the fake diamonds all the way around it. They are so proud. They have to make sure to get the girls in their volleyball. They're doing all kinds of sports now for kids who cannot do it, because if any of you have had kids in youth sports, how expensive is that? It just doesn't allow some kids to participate. And we believe not only should they have the opportunity to be active, but they should have the opportunity to build the networks and the character traits that oftentimes use sports. Teamwork, discipline, reaching goals, learning how to encourage other people. All of those things should be available to these kids as well. In fact, I think I have the numbers here. This is just 1 year. We have 281 kids that are now being served in those athletic programs. And 97% of them are kids of color. I'll tell you another thing that makes me sad is when they talk about how they now have these teams, and now they're competing against other teams. They're traveling places. But I had a meeting with them the other day, and they said, the next thing we have to work on is the fact that our kids are the only ones who don't have any parents cheering them on. And it's not because they don't want to be there, but if, again, any of you understand these tournaments, going to them can be $25, $30, $40 a person for a day. And that's just not available to a lot of families. We also have constructed Schroeder Park Wellness Campus, which is out at Folsom and A Street. It's an area our maps identified as needing more ability for kids to get out and be active. So we built an area there for gathering, for families to gather, for them to work on outside play. There's a couple of soccer fields and basketball courts out there. Get kids out in the neighborhood, in their own neighborhood, where they feel safe and they have accessibility to it, so they can do that. And that place has also become, all kinds of events happening now. People are getting to know each other. There's been lots of education going on, lots of fun fairs. And so we know it can happen in a neighborhood. And I'll tell you what, the city had that property. It wasn't being used. It was just kind of sitting there. And we said, let's make it into something. Let's do something. The city practically, well, they gave us the land pretty much, and there are opportunities to do things that don't cost a lot of money. We're also helped construct the Air Park Community Center. You all know where Air Park is, out there on the other side of the airport, often cut off from a lot of services, and they have this old ramshackle recreation center. And so now the elementary school, the library, and the recreation center are all going to be together. And what a great opportunity for those families. So I want to talk really briefly. Am I okay on time? I'm going to talk really briefly about something that's important to me, and I think it should be important to everybody who lives in this community, and that is adverse childhood experiences. Do any of you know about those? Yeah, a couple of you. They're called ACEs, so if you hear me say ACEs. So the ACEs research tells us, and it's very strong and compelling research, it tells us that the kind of risk and the health you have as an adult is often related to the kind of child abuse and household dysfunction you had growing up. Now, I'm not talking about, I grew up, throwing hay bales or, doing this that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about deep stuff. So for example, if you were hit or punched as a kid, if you had sexual abuse as a kid, if you didn't have enough food to eat, if you had somebody in your home that was incarcerated or somebody that was mentally ill, really tough stuff, but you would be surprised how many kids live with this every day. And the research tells us that the more ACEs you have, in fact, I think the number is 4. If you get up to 4 out of 10, things start to go bad. And it's really hard to unwire that. And I say wire it because it's true. If you look at a brain that's had ACEs and a brain that's not had ACEs, they look entirely different. It's a brain wiring issue. And so unwiring a brain is very difficult. Ask any kindergarten or first grade teacher when they come in. Unwiring your brain is tough, if not impossible. And we just don't spend enough time thinking about these kids who are 0 to 3, before kindergarten. We support our public schools so well in this community, probably not enough, but we support them well, and I'm all for that. What we don't do so well is create a system, a really quality system for preschool, for early education. That's where we fail. In fact, I have child cares in the middle of the community when I say serving primarily poor kids, kids on subsidy. I say, what is your biggest issue? And they literally say to me, trying to get my staff not to leave to go work at Amigos. That's a true thing. They can't keep staff because we pay them so little. We support them. And these are the ones we're asking to take care of a forming brain. We have to do better. And so let me show you really quickly the research. The research says that if you were born and you grew up and you had no ACEs, none of this bad stuff happened to you. There's still going to be some problems. 1 in 16 of you will smoke. 1 in 69 will be alcoholic. 1 in 140 or 480 will use IV drugs. 1 in 14 will have heart disease. There's those health implications I talked about. 1 in 96 will attempt suicide. But let's look at a child who's had, or an adult who had 7 ACEs growing up or more. Suddenly it's 1 in 6 smoke, 1 in 6 are alcoholic. 1 in 30 uses IV drugs, 1 in 6 has heart disease, and 1 in 5 attempts suicide. That period of time between 0 and 3 especially is so critical. So I'm telling you, if you are a teacher, if you are a Sunday school teacher, if you are a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, if you live next door to young children, every one of those touches, every one of those interactions matters as that brain is being wired. And if we're truly going to make a healthier community, we can no longer ignore the fact that we can't just act like if we get them to school, everything will be fine. Schools cannot fix them. And it's our job to work harder to make sure that their brains are wired right to begin with. So we are working on what's called an ACEs Institute, and for some reason the picture's not there. It's a great looking building. I don't know why the picture isn't there, but it is with the Child Advocacy Center. We are building an institute to say we want to educate the community just like I've talked about today. We want people to know this, and we want all of us to work harder. and to work with schools and child cares and all kinds of people to make sure they're aware of how important this period of time is. So my last slide is to talk about older adults. It's not a very, who wants to talk about us, right? But our community is going to change. We know that in this pink area, that's where at least 5% of the population was 75 and older back in 1980. Blue is today, where population is over 75, at least 5% of that population. We're an aging community. Everyone's aging. But it's going to change us. Who's going to take care of us, right? We're already at a lack of of nursing staff. Do you know how much it costs to go into assisted living? I wrote the... What about houses? We build so many houses on 2 levels. Where are aging-friendly homes in our community? What about bus routes? What about transportation? We have to start thinking about those things. Here it is. The population of children under 5 will increase by 19% by 2050 in Lincoln. Those 65 and older will increase by 53% in that amount of time. We're an older community. Number one, we need to get young people to stay here. We have to work hard to keep them to stay here. And second of all, we need to acknowledge the fact that this is happening and really create a much more age-friendly community. So I go back to this slide, which is basically saying it's not so hard to understand the difference when you look at some of the things that are happening in our community. There are simply different risks. There are simply different weights on some neighborhoods than are on others. And this takes me back to the story, Dr. Snow. And then we have another guy. And this is Reverend Henry Whitehead, a missionary, an Anglican priest. And he doesn't look like it. He was actually a really friendly guy. And he spent most of his time just really getting to know the community he lived in, because he was the missionary in Soho. He got to know them. They trusted him. He reached out to them. He ate with them. Some said he drank with them. And he was the person that they relied on. So why is he important to this? He's important because Dr. Snow said, when I'm going around knocking on doors, I don't think they're going to open the door to me. They don't know me, but they know you. Will you come with me, and will you be the person that helps me engage? And he said yes. And if it wasn't for him, none of this would have happened. This is a quote I love so much about him. It says, he was a local. That was his great strength. And I think that's actually all of us are meant to be. To know your community, to know not only where you live in your neighborhood, but beyond. The community where your church sits, the community where your church impacts. We're all called to be locals. And I, especially when I talk to high school and college classes, say, if wherever you go, and I hope it's Lincoln, just remember, wherever you go, to be a local, because it can make a huge difference that you may not know now, but you'll see over time. So here's what you need. You have to have these difficult conversations as a church and as families and as neighborhoods. We have to talk about things. We have to lift the weight of poverty. It's just so foundational to so many of our issues. Embrace the significance of brain science. Go read about this. Google it. Harvard has whole bunches of work around ACEs. You'll be fascinated to see those pictures of the brain and how different they are. This can't be a government solution. It just can't. It's going to take a lot of people, public, private, and the community in general. You need a desire to learn. That curiosity will go a long ways. You need a willingness to act, which is sometimes hard, but has to happen. And then lastly, just be a local. And it'll be amazing how much of a difference you can make. So that's my words of wisdom for today. I hope they've helped you think a little bit about your role, not only as a member of our community, but as a member of this church. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Oh, it's way down here. Sorry about that, folks at home. I'll try to get it. any questions I can help answer? Susan, or?
Can you have specific ideas about how to combat the number of ACEs that kids have?
A lot of it has to do about engaging the broader community into these kids' lives. A lot of it has to do with education of young parents. You know, I think I've talked to a lot of young parents who, in the back of their mind, think, if I can just, you know, I mean, it's not about, these babies can't speak. These babies can't tell you what they're feeling. And so we just go along with the idea that unless they're crying, everything's fine. And there has to be an understanding from the time that baby is born with the mother and the father and everyone surrounding them, that everything that you do has an impact on that child, whether you think they do or not. If they're in the room, if they're hearing yelling, if they're hearing abuse, if they're seeing interactions by people who are not positive, it affects their brains. And so we have to start educating at the time of birth and before, because even it's been shown that when the woman's pregnant, it influences the brain. We have to begin putting this education out from the very beginning, and I think that will go a long ways. And I'll be right there. A lot of us, you know, little things, and I bet you do a lot of these things here, but I was not long ago, I was speaking to a team of folks at the Lincoln electric system. They're kind of leaders. And they said, so what can we do, like as a business, as an electric company? Well, it happened that when I was coming to speak, I was waiting for someone to come get me. You have to go through some doors and things. And I was in the area where people came to pay their bills. A mom came in, she had 3 kids, one on her hip, one here and one over here, running around. She was trying to do her work. The person behind the counter was getting frustrated. And I sat there and I thought, what about if you just, even in your waiting room, you had things that were engaging for a child? There was nothing for these children to do except bother their mother. And so I said to them, what about if you had some things that just engaged the child in a positive experience so that they weren't bothering their mother? Or you do some education with the person behind the counter saying, you know, having 3 young children and paying a bill is not easy. So little things like that. We've talked about places where children can't congregate waiting for their parents. How can they put things in so that that aggravation, you know, of having your kids bother you while you're trying to do something, just little things. But more than anything, it's the nurturing, the loving, the positive interactions can make more difference than you can imagine. Susan had a question, then I'll come back. Susan and Bill are my cousins, just so you know. Bill is my first cousin, and so it was so fun to see them here today.
You were talking about the athletic programs and what it costs for them. We live in a neighborhood where we have a lot of our age, and they go to their grandchildren, and they tell us how expensive it is to go to a tournament, just to go for a day. Is there ways, or is there a way that it can be worked out? Like, who's in control of that? Is the public schools, or where they can maybe make it like you were saying, a poverty line level that you get in for this amount of money, or you get in free because you're at this amount of level or something? How could that maybe happen? Is there a possibility?
It's a very good question with a very long answer, which I won't go into. The system has evolved over time. It used to be high school sports was kind of it. Now there are many, many private for-profit companies that come in, and really we just finished a survey of high school coaches. We sent out a survey. I couldn't believe the schools let us send out the survey, to be honest with you, because there's a lot of consternation going on, and I'm not sure they wanted to know what it was, but they did, to their credit. And we got back all kinds of ideas about how things have changed so much to the point where really, number one, if you're not affluent, you're not going to play. Number two, many high schools say, if you're not playing club sports, don't even try out. And number three, nobody wants to go play for the Y anymore because it's not good enough. So there has been this entire shift, which is not just about the public versus private, it's also about the parents who are in search of this college scholarship or bust kind of mentality. So we have to kind of shift all of that back around, and we have to say, if we're going to ever change these maps that say aerobic fitness is important, we have to recognize that it doesn't matter where you are in the system. It matters that you're doing it. And that's going to take a shift. Now, we are working with them on some policies that allow there to be scholarships, there to be gate fees, like even to go to a high school game, it's going to cost you. And they have like, if you buy a pass, it's non-transferable. Well, let's say, for example, you're in a family that maybe the mom wants to go this week and the dad wants to go this week, but you can only buy one. I mean, these passes are not cheap. But saying they're non-transferable is, can we change some of that? Can we look at things differently? And they're very open to it. So it's an ongoing process, but we also have to just make sure that kids recognize that, it's about their health more than it's about, a college scholarship, for example.
I have a couple questions. My parents maybe eat gross foods. I hate my dad was from foreign ethnic foods, gross like onions and peppers and chives. And then my dad's a borderline pedophile because of spanking naked. I had dropped my pants and I him naked. How many days are more? I was wondering if you're taking all spanking. If you take what my dad did, spanking naked is borderline pedophilia and making kids eat gross foods they don't like ethnic foods. But do you think spanking is anything wrong?
I'm not going to get into I think there's various degrees of a lot of things. Spanking is not listed. Now, being hit or touched inappropriately is. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that if that's your interpretation, I think that that's something that you have to, if it's affecting you still today, no doubt it's probably an adverse childhood experience. Yeah.
I have a question. I belong to another group, which is Woods Park Keep It Green. And Woods Park is up 33rd Nose.
Yeah.
And they're trying to expand the tennis courts, which is great because they do offer tennis to lower income kids, but it's taking away the green space. Do you have any statistics on how important it is for kids to be outside, to be playing outside, to have green space to play in? Because kids of all colors come and play soccer in that park. They play baseball in that park. It's always full. And we want to make sure that it stays that way. I didn't know if you track some of that.
We don't have any, the question always comes down to safety. Do kids feel safe there? And if it's a park where kids feel safe, it's amazing what kids can do with just a flat piece of grass. And so I think as long as the activity's there, and of course I'm all in favor of the more kids, the better. So if you're getting more kids out there playing pickup soccer games, then you're gonna get going inside to tennis lessons. I think that's right. Now it's tough to stand in the way of what some people think is the most important, especially if that's where the resources lie. But I would certainly hold anyone accountable to the idea that if you're going to build this, it should be even more accessible to low-income families. Tennis is an interesting thing. It's kind of gotten this reputation as a country club sport. And I think, there's certainly some merit to that. But at the end of the day, given the number of tennis courts there are around the community, you can walk into them, there's no fee. It is accessible in a great way. So as long as it's accessible and there's not a cost associated with it, perhaps it can have some merit. But if it's closing itself off to the majority of the kids, then I can see why you would. It's all about accessibility and safety. Yeah.
What are you doing to address the needs for better pay for people who take care of others? It's not just childcare workers, but it's CNAs who work in nursing homes.
Absolutely, I'm 100% with you. She asked about the pay of people, and our society has gone astray in how we value people. You look at the people who are taking care of folks in assisted living and nursing homes, and you look at the folks who are taking care of our youngest children, and we underpay them dramatically. We're working on a couple of things in that regard. Some of it is policy related. Some of it is creating opportunities for there to be, some of it is based on what in some of these instances, low-income childcare, for example, will get subsidies from the government. And that subsidy has to cover everything. And it doesn't leave much left for folks. So we're looking at changing those subsidy rates. We're looking at if we can, we also accompanying with that a rise in the appreciation, and that's not the word I'm trying to say, but the recognition, the awareness of this work. Because I think sometimes people go into it with the idea that this is going to be so fulfilling to me. And what happens after a while is you're like, yes, it is fulfilling, but how come I'm not that important? How come I'm not seen as that important? And that is part of a cultural shift we just have to make. We have to be willing to say, why are we investing in things like, I won't even throw out an example, but why are we not investing in this? We have to call the question. Because you are absolutely right. And it's going to change more and more. Let me give you another example. We have a number of folks who come here from different countries who have healthcare experience, but they have language barriers. Getting into healthcare with language barriers is because it's a whole other language, right? So we have set up a program where we have a prep course, a prep language course for refugees and immigrants at Lincoln Literacy. And we say, if you've had experience in your home country in healthcare, we would like you to come and we will pay for you to have this prep course so that you can go to a CNA course. And then we'll pay for you to get your CNA. And at the end of the day, what we want many of these folks to do, these long-term care facilities, hospitals, is we want them to commit to putting these workers on a trajectory toward a career. If you get stuck there, it's never going to change unless we change the pay. But say, for example, at Bryan, they say, if you come in as a CNA, we will then help you become a med aid, and then we will help you become an LPN, and then we will help you become, that's how we change people's lives for the better. The entry level, though, is still hard. It is still hard. My dad was in an assisted living for almost 2 years, and every day I would say, I know I wrote that check. Where is it all going? And I think we need to have also an understanding of how those funds are being spent within those organizations, within those facilities. Because I'm not sure that the profit and the expenses are balancing out in my mind anyway. It was a big check. In fact, Susan and Bill will understand this. My dad was a very proud man. He wanted to be in an apartment. He needed to be there, but he was worried about how much it would cost. And so I grew up in a really small town called Table Rock. It's a town of about 300 people. And so I went to the bank and I said, can we set up a second checking account that only I write out of, that he doesn't see? Because he'd still read all of his bank statements. And I think that's highly illegal, but they did it. And so I would write the check every month out of that account. And my dad would say, who's paying for me to be here? And I would, for 2 years, I had to come up with a number of excuses. Well, you have a little bit of long-term care insurance. Well, you have a little bit of it. And he let it go. But I always knew that if I had to tell him how much it was costing him, he would get up and I would go to visit him and he would be sitting on the front step, waiting for me. Yeah. So, anything else? You ask a very good question, and I wish I had an answer. And the fact is, I think until there is a culture shift on what's really important, and until we all say, this is too important for us not to make a change, I'm not sure how else small tweaks are going to fix it. I wish I had an answer for that one. I talk about that one a lot.
Yes, that goes along with my question. How optimistic are you that things will change?
Well, it depends on the day. Sometimes, when I go and I see some of the things that are happening in these neighborhoods, and I see some of the things that are going on, when I see people step up and say, I want to be part of the solution, I'm very optimistic. On other days, when I see nonprofits fighting with each other over money or over services, or I see the number of nonprofits continue to expand, but the impact's not changing. I was just talking the other day to somebody who wanted to start a nonprofit, and I'm like, I think we have enough nonprofits. I think what we need to figure out is how to pool our resources together to make a difference with what we have. Because every time we create a nonprofit, everybody needs, rent and a director and copy machine and all those kinds of things. And it's only taking money away. We need to figure out how to work better together. And we also need folks like you in this church and other churches to say, we're going to do it as part of our mission. Because we want to make this place we're in better. Well, I don't want to keep you all. You all have been terrific, and I appreciate it. I do have copies of all the maps here. You're welcome to take those with you if you'd like. And Pastor Abby, when we get the new book out, I'm happy to share it with you as well. It'll be this fall sometime. Thank you.